Head of government, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's, I close the book. It's a great pleasure to be back in Andorra. I was here when Andorra held the chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. And it was indeed a very good chairmanship, and it was during this chairmanship that education again became a very hot topic, very important issue for the Council of Europe. And Andorra is a very good evidence that you don't need to be big to be important. It's sufficient to have a lot of wisdom. And indeed, this wisdom exists in this country, and therefore I'm very glad to be back. And I'm also very glad to learn that Andorra has gone through very important reforms, and therefore it's also a good example for all countries in the world that you have to adapt to new realities, and indeed to adapt to the new characteristic of the modern world, namely that people attach more and more importance to their rights, to the rule of law, to transparency, indeed, openness, and this is the only way, as I see it, to prevail in the times we are going through. I have been asked to speak about, of course, the Council of Europe, and I would like to start by explaining what it is. It's not the European Union. It's Council of Europe was started right after the World War II, and we got the European Convention on Human Rights, which established a huge machinery in order to get the member states to uphold human rights and the rule of law. There are a number of monitoring bodies, advisory bodies, parliamentary assembly, and then on top of this machinery we have the Court of Human Rights, to which every individual on the European continent can make a complaint if they believe that their own authorities are not in conformity with the obligations under the convention. So you see, this is unique in history, is unprecedented in the world today. It has never happened before that people can go to an international court and make such a complaint, and indeed people on the European continent do it. Thousands are going to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and it is, so to say, the cornerstone of the whole convention system, which makes the European Convention different from any other international convention. For instance, the Universal Declaration under the UN is, of course, very important, but it doesn't have this court. That's a difference, and therefore I say that the European Convention on Human Rights is the only real implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I've been asked to speak about the role of human rights and the rule of law in the context of security, stability, and peace. This was the reason why we got the convention and the Council of Europe as the guardian of the convention after the war, because what we saw before the war was what Winston Churchill said, that where human rights and rule of law end, tyranny begins. And we got the war, and therefore after the war, the leaders of the world decided that the peace, in particularly in Europe, the peace had to be built on human rights and the rule of law. So we got the European Convention. And we speak today about democratic security, which is actually the role of human rights and rule of law in creating peace and stability on the European continent. And this is actually more important, it's easier to see today. You mentioned, Mr. Moderator, that I have been president of the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize Committee. And for us, it has always been, and this is why we have awarded the Peace Prize to so many human rights defenders, because there is a clear connection between defending human rights and peace. It's a clear connection between upholding rule of law and peace. We can see it, clearly that democratic societies, they very seldom or never go to war with each other. And democratic societies, they put constraints on the power so that we don't get misuse of power, that we don't get corruption, which very often leads to conflicts and wars. And we can also say clearly that democratic societies promote and foster tolerance and inclusiveness, which is also a precondition for peace and stability. Actually, here education comes in very much, because education is about inclusiveness, including people in societies. This is why we awarded Malala 2 years ago to the Nobel Peace Prize, because we see the role of education for creating peace, such an important thing. And I will also like to make the point here that, of course, in order to promote development, economic development, we need education. And it is also clear that democratic societies, they provide education to their citizens, simply because citizens want to have education. So it becomes a necessity for democratic societies to provide education to the young people. I do not say that authoritarian regimes also provide education. It's true. But it is also very true that in many authoritarian societies, they do not allocate resources for education for young people. Look at the misery in the whole Middle East, where the young people do not have any prospect for their life. They don't have education. They don't get jobs. And you see what happens. Now, let me make some few examples on what I'm talking about, just to, from the real life in Europe and in the neighborhood of Europe. Look at Ukraine. This conflict, which became a war on the European continent, the first one after the Second World War, this conflict didn't start with the Russian annexation of Crimea. It was, of course, outrageous what they did, that they simply moved in and annexed a territory on the European continent. This was totally I cannot find a word for what happened, but it was, of course, not in conformity with the rule of law and international law. But the conflict didn't start with this. It started in Ukraine itself. And why? I have followed this for years. I've been there time and again. I was there as Prime Minister, as Foreign Minister, as head of the Parliament, and head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Norwegian Parliament. I saw what was going on in Ukraine, and I saw it indeed when I came to Strasbourg. It was so easy to say what would happen because of the corruption. Why did the corruption come? Because there was not independent courts. The media were not free. The oligarchs were the owner of the media. The oligarchs controlled the judiciary, the courts, and the oligarchs also controlled the parliament. Can you imagine? The oligarchs wanted to have a seat in the parliament because when they got a seat in the parliament, they couldn't be prosecuted because of the broad immunity privileges that they enjoyed in the parliament. So what do you get when you don't have independent courts, when you don't have independent media, when you don't have a parliament that is willing and able to control the power? Corruption. And at the end of the day, people could not tolerate this any longer. They went to the streets in Kiev. You remember what happened on Maidan, the square? The revolution came on the 21st of February, and then the conflict started. So you see, if you don't have human rights and rule of law, you get this kind of instability. And this is a huge country. It should be the richest country in Europe, actually, because of the fertile soil and the potential for the industries and all this. But it became one of the poorest, and it was not able to defend itself when the Russian aggression started, because the corruption has taken away all the resources also from the defense, from the military. So the Russians could do what they wanted to do, and they did it. So this is about democratic security. It's not sufficient to have a military defense if you don't have a defense in democratic institutions based on rule of law and human rights. The same thing happened on the other side of the Mediterranean. The Arab Spring. Why did this, the man in the grocery shop in Tunisia put himself on fire? He did it in order to protest against the corruption in Tunisia, against the authoritarian corrupted regime. And he started what became the Arab Spring. It was, people went to the streets. They were fed up there also with corruption. And the corruption came because there were not independent courts, not independent media, and not a parliament that was functioning. So we got the Arab Spring. In Tunisia, it has become quite successful, I would say, also because of the Council of Europe, assisted them in building institutions, a new constitution, independent judiciary and all this. But elsewhere, where we also got the Arab Spring, it became a real catastrophe. In Syria. You see now, Europe is, so to say, of course, the people living in Syria, in Libya. They are those who are suffering most, but we are also the recipients of this tragedy on the other side of the Mediterranean. And dear friends, believe me, this is not the end of the story. This is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of the story. Because we have so many regimes in this neighborhood that we have a great potential for the same upheaval, the same instability, and the same tragedy. So he explains clearly what happens when we don't have independent institutions and distributional power. Distributional power is a key word. Turkey nowadays. I went to Turkey immediately after the military coup, because I understood that what would happen afterwards would be so decisive for Europe. But first of all, we need to understand how it happened and what happened actually. And I said in clear words, and I would like to repeat it here. In Europe, political power has to come from the ballot boxes, not from the gun pipes. What happened in Turkey was that, some circles in the military and also in the judiciary wanted to have political power through military means. It has no place at all on the continent based on rule of law. Military men, they have to be loyal to the flag, to the government, and not loyal to a person outside or to secret networks. And the same goes, of course, with the judiciary and the judges in the courts, that judges in the courts must be loyal to the law and not loyal to people outside the law. These are basic things which we have agreed upon in Europe, and all of a sudden we got a military coup attempt by people that have infiltrated the military and the judiciary. So again, it explains how dangerous it is not to uphold these basic principles. And now it is, of course, incredibly important that Turkey are doing the right things and not, of course, they have the right to go after those who were behind the military coup attempt. But they have to do it on the basis of rule of law, on the law. And we have clear standards in Europe, established standards in the convention itself and also in the case law of the court. So those who are now being investigated, prosecuted, and brought to the courts, they have the rights enshrined in the convention and described in the case law of the Court of Human Rights. So it's incredibly important that these standards are being upheld and that they are not going after people that obviously had nothing to do with the military coup attempt itself, and that they are not going after people for other purposes. Because what are the risks if this happens? The risk are that they will create the environment or preconditions for revenge. So one may now lay the ground for reconciliation, or one may lay the ground for the opposite. And again, you see how important the law is to uphold the standards in the law, and that there are independent courts that are able to take on this in a serious way. So another example on the importance of upholding basic human rights, individual rights, and the rule of law is how we take on the so-called homegrown terrorism. First of all, we need to understand why it has developed. Well, there are many theories. I don't think that anybody knows have the full answer on this, but it is obviously about alienation, exclusion, the way we have treated people, and the way we have been or not have been able to include the people coming from the outside. But there are many other reasons behind it. If you look at each individual case, it's obviously about personal tragedies, very much behind those who have been recruited to these networks. But my point here is that it is important how we take on this. If we do it without respect for the rule of law and for individual rights, we may get the opposite result. Look what the Americans did in Iraq with the torture. And all of us remember Abu Ghraib and how this has been exploited by the terrorist networks. It would have been much better not to have it than what we saw on the television screens and how this has been exploited. So, I mean, if we are not able to deal with this on the basis of human rights and the rule of law, then we may get the opposite result. And this is why, for instance, back in 2005, Council of Europe worked out a convention which became, so to say, textbook for the UN as well. We worked out a convention on how to deal with terrorism based on the rule of law and human rights. We were able to work out such a convention on the European continent. And now, when we got this new phenomenon, foreign terrorist fighters, then the UN Security Council asked us to work out an additional protocol on how we could take on this new phenomenon based on rule of law and human rights, because they didn't want to make new mistakes. So we got a new additional protocol to this convention, which described very narrowly how European member states should deal with this phenomenon. It was very important. We have to work in the prisons. We have to work or combat hate speech and racism on the internet, because much of the radicalization has been going on in prisons, but also on internet. And it's an interesting phenomenon how the social media are functioning today. Of course, they can be very positive, but it's also a fertile ground for radical ideas, extremism. And we should be aware of the following, that, well, the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims, we are called the people of the book because we refer to the book, the Bible or the Quran. But very few people are reading the book now. But they are reading the distorted version of in particular, the Quran on the internet. They get the distorted version of the Quran in the prisons. So they are told that to be a real Muslim, you have to be a jihadist. So, I mean, we have to work on these things, and which the Council of Europe is doing. We are working in the prisons. We have the no hate speech on the internet, and the schools are, of course, incredibly important. What I think is important in Europe today is to understand that nearly the only place where all people can meet are in the schools. There we have a common platform. Our societies have become so fragmented But there is one place where people are together, and this is in the schools. And what we teach in the schools are so important. And that's why and here is where Andorra comes in, started during the chairmanship of Andorra in the Committee of Ministers. And we have worked out now a clear, so to say, program for how, or a tool for how all the member states can teach what it means to be a citizen in Europe today. What are the values we build on? What does rule of law mean? And we have descriptors on what they should learn at each level in the education system. We did the same with regard to languages in Europe. We've worked out clear descriptors on how our member states should, or schools should teach languages at different levels in the education system. And this is being used by governments across the continent. And I think that this new tool on what it means to teach, what it means to be a democratic citizens, can be an equally important tool. Well, have I spoken too long? Yes, I think so. I will come to an end by saying that we are going through incredible changes in the world and in each and every society. The winds of change are blowing every day. What we need to now to recall is what I started with. Namely, there are some basic values that should not change. We should recall why we got them, why we got the common standards, the common values. And actually what happened after the World War was that, you know, the war came because of nasty nationalism. So the people that came together to form the United Nations, they said we have to move from nationalism towards internationalism. So we got the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we got the UN Charter establishing the UN Security Council and many of the UN bodies. And we got the European Convention on Human Rights, which was a concrete implementation of the human rights universal declaration. So we need to remember this. But I say this also because there are a lot of revival of nationalism against on our continent as well. Many nationalistic tendencies. And therefore it's important to have in mind that nationalism once again may lead to what we saw. It is like what President Mitterrand said once in the European Parliament, that nationalism always leads to war. It's the end result. And this is why our nation state need to uphold the basic principles in the European Convention on Human Rights. And I would like to remind us all about the basic principle in human rights, namely, and rule of law. Namely, that the Universal Declaration, as well as the European Convention, put limits on the power of the nation state. That was the whole idea. That before the war, the power of the nation state was unlimited. So one saw the need for putting limits on the power of the nation state. the nation state should not be allowed to do everything it wanted. And human rights also means that there are constraints to the power of the majority inside nation states. The majority can simply not do whatever they want. That's why I told President Erdogan, when he started talking about death penalty, he said that, well, if people in Turkey want to have death penalty, I will agree. But I said, President, your obligation under the European Convention is that the majority cannot decide to have death penalty. It's against human rights. It's against your obligations under the European Convention. So human rights have put constraints on the nation state as well as the power of the majority inside nation states. So rule of law in this context means for Europe that all nation states needs to have laws in conformity with the standards in the European Convention, and that there is a court on the top of the whole convention system, namely the court in Strasbourg, that has the final word. When the court has ruled, then this is the final word. This is rule of law. Other states have rule of law. I mean, China has rule of law. But they don't have laws in conformity with human rights standards. This is a difference. And we need to have this in mind in the debate going on around Europe now, otherwise we will really be on the wrong track. Well, there are many students here. I'm an old man. I can give you two advices. One is to be innovative. Albert Einstein, he once distributed an exam to his students. And then one student raised his hand and said, Mr. Einstein, these are the questions we got 1 year ago. And then Einstein said, yes, but there are new answers now. So there are always new answers. And the other thing is to try to understand the other side. Try to understand what is going on in other societies, in other communities. I remember once when I think one of the most famous Norwegians during all times, Mr. Thorbjørn Jagland, that probably some of you remember the Kon-Tiki journey over the Pacific Ocean, at the mercy of the Pacific Ocean, to prove that people in Polynesia came from the west and not from the east. He made a lecture on Norwegian University once, and then afterwards one of the students asked, Mr. Heyerdahl, who do you think discovered America? Was it Christopher Columbus or was it Leif Erikson? And then Heyerdahl answered, ask those who were on the shores when they came. So he had the ability to understand the world from the other side, not from the side of the white man, but from the side of the people that have already arrived on the American continent. And this is incredibly important in today's world, that try to understand how other people are thinking. What is their history? Only then we are able to live together in peace. And again, I would like to say to all of you, please help us to maintain what was the main idea after the Second World War, namely internationalism instead of nationalism. Thank you very much.